All right, here we are, about to head out to another author event. Lois Lowry. We've seen her before, so we've had most of her books signed already, but she is promoting a kid's book, and so we bought the kid's book in order to go to the event, and we'll get that signed. So off we go.
I don't know what we're doing about food, though.
She's looking up food because we're hungry. That's our method of operation
we're not,
anyway.
super hungry, and that's the problem.
That's what we do anyway, because it's part of the adventure is just to go get food, right? But nobody's going with us today, so we are on our own. So we ended up not getting food because we didn't have enough time. So I guess we're just gonna go to our thing now, and it's at this cool library. You did? In there or in the library? What's over there? What's that? Huh. Huh. Cool auditorium. Yes, I like it. You've not been here? You forgot. If you have, you forgot.
And on behalf of the King's English Bookshop, Brain Food Books, we welcome you to tonight's event. Acclaimed author of 10 novels, she has also written 2 book-length works of nonfiction. In addition to writing, like she needed something more, Sara hosted the long-running podcast, This Creative Life, and is on the MFA faculty at Lesley University in Cambridge, Mass. A watershed book for me and for my students is The Giver. My students love wrestling with the idea of utopia. But universally, they just like the indie. 6th graders, being their adolescent selves, want closure, want the story finished. Not happily ever after, mind you, but certainly not ambiguity. There they are, struggling to figure out what will happen next without an author to tie things up neatly for them. With a singular warmth and generosity, Lois has now illuminated a new ambiguity, a new opportunity, asking how those of us who've been around for a while interact with those much younger. Tree, table, book, deftly weaves the threads of varied perspectives into the complex fabric of the humanity we all share. Lois is not just a great teller of stories, but a human being living a deep and thoughtful life, sharing wisdom, building bridges over troubled waters. Lois is the quintessential explorer of our human ambiguity, and the harbinger of delicious possibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, Lois Lowry.
Did you already sense kind of what the overarching theme of your material was going to be? Or did that emerge as you created a body of work?
I was the middle of 3 children, and I had a sister who was 3 years older and who began first grade when I was 3 years old and she was 6. And she came home every day and said, "Let's play school, I'll be the teacher." And she taught me to read when I was just 3. But in many ways, she was a very important person in my life, as a sister is, of course. Not only was she my first teacher, she was my best friend, often my worst enemy. We got in trouble together as teenagers. Occasionally, she gave me my first drink of wine when she was in college and I was just in high school. Anyway, I set that aside for a moment. She's off in college, I'm in high school, and then she went to Penn State. She was homecoming queen, and she was the pretty one, I was the smart one. And then I got a scholarship to study writing at Brown University. Big fight with my father about where I was going to go to college, and I won and I went to Brown. Penn State would have been cheaper, and Brown was very expensive, but they did give me a scholarship. Okay, so I go to college, and I'm in this special writing program, and I'm jumping over a lot of stuff I could tell you, but anyway, end of my sophomore year, because I was sophomoric, I dropped out of college and got married because my boyfriend was 21 and had graduated. I had just turned 19. This is a thing that girls often did in those days, long ago in the 1950s. And then my aspirations to be a writer got put on hold because I had a baby when I was 21. No, actually she was born a month before my 21st birthday. So I had a baby when I was 20, baby when I was 21, baby when I was 23, baby when I was 24, and then I was 25 years old, and I had 4 children under the age of 4.5. And I probably wondered from time to time why I had ever dropped out of college. But very shortly after that 4th child was born, he was born on November 5th, 1962. And on December 7th, 1 month and 2 days later, I got a telegram. A man in a uniform, like an old movie, a man in a Western Union uniform was at the door holding a yellow envelope. I answered the door with a baby in my arms and a toddler pulling at my leg. And this man said, "We deliver the ones with bad news. I'm sorry." And he gave me this telegram, and it told me that my sister had died. So my oldest child was a girl, 4.5 at that time, and she was, and remains, my most sensitive and empathic child, I think. And I tried to, she had never met my sister, who lived in Texas, and I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I tried to tell her about my sister and growing up with my sister and the loss that was to me. And she would listen for a little while, but then she would wiggle off my lap and go to play with her little brother. So I ended up telling that story, I think, to myself, as we do. I'm guessing you do too. We're actually the same person sitting here, dressed slightly differently. And I carried it around with me, retelling it, shaping it, trying to make the ending better. And time passed, and those kids, and when my youngest child, born when my sister died, when he was 5 and went to kindergarten, I went back to college. Took me 4 years to get my degree, and then I went to graduate school, and now I was starting to write and think about writing, but I had these 4 kids and a house and a husband and all the rest of it. So finally, one day when I was, well, I don't remember how old I was, but the kids were all in school. Husband had gone off to his office, And we lived in Maine at the time. I went out to scrape the leftover scrambled eggs into the dog's dish on the back porch. And it was November. And I don't know if any of you have been to Maine or in the late fall, but the air has a certain smell to it. You live by the sea, and the pine trees are there, and the leaves are coming off the other trees, and you can smell all of that. And there's the kids' pumpkin left over from Halloween rotting on the porch. And the breeze was blowing, and it brought back a memory from my childhood. And I went in the house to the same typewriter I had used in college, and I wrote this memory about a particular day in my childhood when I was 9 years old. And I had a friend who was herself a writer. She was a journalist. And I sent her this, and she wrote back. This is long before email. She wrote back, and she said, someone would publish that. So I said, and nowadays there are very few magazines that publish short fiction. In those days there were more, but I sent it to a magazine, and they immediately bought it and published it. It was, I think the magazine still exists, Red Book, but they don't publish fiction anymore. But they published that story, and after it was published, I got a letter which had been sent to the magazine because nobody knew my address, and the magazine editor sent it on to me. It was from a Houghton Mifflin editor of children's books, and she said, "You sound like somebody who might be able to write a book for young readers. Would you consider writing a book for Houghton Mifflin?" They didn't promise to publish it, but at least there was an editor at the other end of the phone or the mail. Nowadays, it's of course only email, who was waiting to see it. And I sat down and wrote the story of my sister and me. And that's why it became my first book. Even though I had all those kids to whom I read children's books every night, it had never occurred to me to write for kids. I was writing serious grown-up fiction, I thought.
Let's talk about Tree Table Book for a moment. It's this wonderful story about a friendship between two Sophies. They're each at an opposite end of a life experience. We have Sophie, our narrator, who's 11, and then Sophie, her neighbor and friend, who's 88. It's a fast read in terms of the conciseness of the prose. There's not a word wasted. But as the older Sophie's story is revealed, we're into some serious territory again that has been a hallmark of so many of your books. What was the seed of this particular idea? Do you think of the characters first, or a situation you want to write about? And with this particular story, how did it come to you? How did it arrive?
I think it's fair for me to say that always a character comes first, and a vague idea. I think, it's always hard to remember exactly how your thoughts were working, but I believe what I was thinking about was a relationship between an older person and a young person. And I have thought and even said to a few people since this book has been published, which is right now, that this is the first time I ever dealt with that particular configuration. But that's not true, that's a lie, because in that very first book, when the younger sister is going through the illness and death of her older sister, she turns to an elderly neighbor and who comforts her and gives that element of friendship that her grieving parents can't provide. So perhaps that's something that's always been with me, but also it is true that I have reached the age now that I have grandchildren, and so I have a particular interest in I'm not going to use the right word.
Generational, intergenerational.
Yeah, but it's not multi-generational, it's bi-generational. Anyway, relationships between people, close relationships between people of different generations, which can be, I think, very special. And actually, the book The Giver, which Nathan mentioned in his very lovely introduction, deals with an old man giving his stories to a boy. So perhaps it's something that's pervasive within me.
This book is a more buoyant book than The Giver in terms of like the tone of it.
Yeah.
But we do come back to that territory. In this case, it's grounded in this friendship, neighbors, community, in a different way.
And also, let me point out, because I've done this in other books too, in other ways, I found a gimmick.
That's all we're looking for when we're writing, something to hang on to. And I wonder how or if your feelings or concerns about the importance of sharing memory and a shared idea of history, how has that changed or evolved or stayed the same between The Giver and Tree Table book?
Yeah. And probably other earlier books as well. I'm now remembering in one of the Anastasia books, her grandmother dies. And so again, there's that, whatever it is that draws the two people and the memories together. I have often told this, and I'll make it brief, this story, because the question I am most often asked is how I got the idea for The Giver. And I've been asked, and of course, you can't make up a new answer every time. And so, there's only one answer. And I confess to having become kind of impatient. I hope I didn't show it when people would ask me that. And then my own granddaughter asked me once, she was about 10, and I realized that, for every kid who asks that question, it's the first time they've asked it. But the answer that I always have to give, because it is the one answer, is that my father was very old and was losing his memory. And I went to visit him, and we looked through a photograph album, and there were two little blonde girls in pink dresses. And he said, "There you are with your sister." And then he said, "I can't remember her name." And I said, "Her name was Helen, Dad. She was named for her grandmother." And he said, "Whatever happened to her?" And I had to tell him about her death. People have asked when I've told that story, "Why did you tell him?" And it never occurred to me that you can't lie to somebody you love. I told him in the gentlest way possible, and it was part of his history, of course. But I could also see that he had been made more comfortable by the repression of that memory. And so, when I left that day from the nursing home where I was visiting him, I began to think, as a writer does, I'm sure you do, what if there were a way that you could manipulate human memory and people wouldn't have to remember or wouldn't be able to remember things that made them sad or scared? Wouldn't that be great? And of course, no, it wouldn't, because you would sacrifice so much. Our memories are so valuable. And so that was the origin of that theme of that book, and I'm sure probably it comes along in a different way and suddenly pops up again in this book when I sit down to write about a child and an elderly friend. And I'm not sure I knew the details of the plot, if there is a plot of some sort, but clearly the same things were going to come into play. When I mentioned the gimmick, it was simply this, that the elderly friend who lives alone next door is beginning to lose fragments of memory. Now, I know, and maybe I don't see anybody old enough to know or have experienced this, but I will tell you that when you're my age and you go to the doctor, they give you this test, and they tell you to remember, I'm going to say 3 words, and I want you to remember them, and later I will ask you to repeat them. And I always pass that test. The time will come when I don't, but I always do, and I do it because I have a very visual memory. And when my doctor says bird, grass, car. I immediately picture a robin with a piece of grass hanging out of his beak sitting on the hood of my car, and I can remember those 3 words. So, the child in the book is aware that her friend is losing her memory, and that's going to put their relationship in jeopardy because the woman's son wants to move her to an assisted living place. So, my husband is a doctor, retired, but he has a Merck manual sitting on his desk. And a Merck manual is the book that all doctors have, and it has everything medical in it, and it gives you the instructions on how to give that test. And so the child borrows a Merck manual from a neighbor who's a doctor, and she attempts to teach her friend, her 88-year-old friend, how to pass this test. That's the gimmick. And it allows, actually, it was fun for me to use that gimmick because it allowed me to insert bits of humor in which is essentially a sad story. For example, one of the questions you will be asked someday, the Merck manual says, give the patient an object and ask the patient to name the object. I could give Sarah this, and she would say,
It's a bottle of water. Yep.
But in the book, the child giving the test to her friend is sitting in the kitchen, picks up a fork and hands it to the old woman and says, name this object. And the woman thinks a long time, and then she says, Mary Ellen. and the child thinks, okay, that's a good answer.
Thinking back to when you were a mom of young kids, because I know that is true, a lot of writers in our community here are mothers and mothers of young kids, wondering when they're ever going to find time for themselves again. Do you remember how you kind of nurtured, even if you couldn't take the time to sit down and write during those years, do you remember anything about how you kept nurturing your imagination and your dreams?
Yeah, nobody's ever asked me that before, so I've never asked myself, but I told my kids stories. We lived, stories were a part of our existence, I think. And at one point, after my kids were adults, one of my kids died in his 30s, but the other 3 are all grown up. And one of them was about to move to a new house and found in his old stuff a copy of a book that I had written and illustrated badly for him when he was a little boy. And it was called The Hippo and the Hollyhocks. And well, I won't bore you with the story, but it's actually kind of a cute story.
That's great. I love that. And thinking about some of our future writers in the audience, some of our young folks, well, there's a little bit in the book that has storytelling advice that I thought you might read a little bit from that section in chapter 3.
Okay.
I have it all ready
Yeah,
for
and
you.
while she's looking for it, I'll just explain that the book is written in the first person, and so the child is herself interested in how to write a story. Later she elicits the stories from her next door neighbor, but this is early in the book.
Yeah, she's kind of talking about when one day an author came and visited her at school and gave some writing tips, and one of the writing tips...
Wait 1 second. I just got to interject something.
Yes,
So
do it.
If I don't tell this, I'll forget to tell
Do it.
But Sarah and I have both gone into schools and talked to groups of kids, and it's always wonderful in some ways, and every now and then something unusual happens. This did not happen to me, but it happened to another author, and she's now dead. But I wish it had happened to me because I feel like a liar. I can't pretend it happened to me. She was in a school, and it was young kids, like 2nd grade, and she was talking to them, and then she said, "Does anybody have a question?" And somebody's hand went up, and the child said, "Why does your face hang down that way?"
This is the sheer terror of elementary school. Well, an author visits Sophie's school, and though that question doesn't come up, kids do ask how much money the author makes, that's always an interesting question. But one of the pieces of writing advice that this author gives the kids at the school is to start a story on a day that is different. And I thought maybe you might just pick up from that second paragraph, but it's every day different.
Okay.
Just to give us a flavor of Sophie's voice.
Yeah, I guess you described this, but an author has come to the school.
Mm-hmm.
I like the earlier part.
Sure, it's your book.
An author once visited my school and talked about writing books. Kids ask a lot of questions. They ask how much money she makes, and does she have pets, and is she going to write another book? You've been asked all those questions, haven't you? I have. Her answers were, not enough, haha, and yes, a poodle, and yes, I am going to write another book. But then a kid asked, what is the best way to start a book? And her answer was, begin on the day that is different. But this is now the child speaking, isn't every day different? Even the most ordinary day is different from the one before. For example, on Sunday, I wore flip-flops all day. But Sunday night on 60 Minutes, they talked about Lyme disease, and it made me nervous. So yesterday, Monday, I wore sneakers and tucked the bottoms of my jeans into my socks just to keep deer ticks from getting at. So the day was different. It was also very hot. So the question is how to end a book when it's part of a series. I suppose it would be a good idea to give a hint that's more to come.
Yeah, maybe not a cliffhanger, not the end of one TV episode where you're going to the next, nothing too dramatic. You still want the book to feel finished on its own, but leaving open possibilities.
I'm thinking now about the Anastasia Krupnik series. The very end of the first book, she's 10 years old, her baby brother is born. That's what the book is about, an impending new sibling. She's the only child till then. And I don't remember, I haven't reread these in a long time, but there may be some mention, I know. They have to make a bedroom for it in the pantry of their apartment, because their apartment doesn't have another bedroom. And so you know that they need a bigger house. The next book, the baby is now 2 years old, and they're moving to a new house. So you give a hint. There's a progression happening.
Something that you can use to kind of connect over to the next one, to get the next one started.
Yeah, the teachers asked me if I would Zoom with their classrooms, and I just didn't have the time to do it. But for some reason I decided, because I was also getting these other requests, that I would do Zooms with classrooms in other countries, because The Giver is used in schools in, I think, 27 other countries. And what was really interesting to me, I could only do it, of course, if the kids spoke English, but in most other countries, the kids learn English. Many other countries are good that way. And I found that they all had the same general concern. They would say to me, and these were kids in Romania, in, amazingly, Iran, Brazil, Japan, Korea, Italy, they would say to me, how can we keep our world from becoming that kind of world? And I guess that's the thing that I would hope kids would take away from that book, a feeling that I would be the one to point out to them, you are the guys who are going to create the future. And because you're thinking that way now, you're the guys who are going to fix it. People would have thought, for the best of reasons, we'd like to protect our kids. And we don't have wars anymore. We've advanced. We're not at war with anybody. Let's not have them read books about war. And so a lot of books would be taken away. And then something else, and something else. And you wouldn't notice because it would happen slowly. And then the time comes when there are no more books. Now, this book, I've had a number of books that have been censored or banned. This book is very can't think of the word.
It's not
Uncontroversial.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yet, she says. And this book has only just been published, but I have already heard that somebody objects to this. The child, Sophie, is 11. She's just had her birthday. And her mother has reminded her to write thank you notes for her birthday presents. So she says, my birthday was 3 weeks ago. I have written to my grandparents, blouse, ugly. I have written to my aunt and uncle, book, babyish. And I still have great Aunt Kate to do. She sent me bath salts. I do not know what to do with bath salts. I read somewhere that you can get a urinary tract infection putting additives in your bath water. I am not going to risk it. Somebody has already said, why are we having to have urinary tract infections in a book?
Oh boy. I mean, I'd like to eliminate urinary tract infections. They still exist.
Most of my main characters are female because I was a girl and I remember being a young girl. But even in the boy characters, I see parts of myself. I don't think you can create a character. I think at least the writer has to love their character. I don't think you can create a character that you love without putting some of yourself in there. Doing what I'm doing is because I don't do the same thing over and over again. I suppose there are authors who like writing the same type of book, but I have written many different types of books, and some of them are, well, there's a series, Gooneyberg Green series, that are all set in second grade. And then some of them are much more mature level. And I do that because it keeps me from getting tired of what I do. I have never been a fan of science fiction, so I completely avoided the science involved. Although I frequently get letters, emails, usually from boys, explaining things about the rods and the cones and why they don't see color. I just didn't deal with any of that. But what I was dealing with was the future, and the future consists of whatever you decide it is. And you said utopia. Most people think of that book as dystopia.
Well, I think every dystopia starts as a utopia, like you think it's going to be great.
Yeah. Wrong.
And then, wrong, yeah. Yes.
What's your favorite book that you didn't write?
A favorite book that you didn't write?
A favorite book that I did not write.
This is always a hard one because
It is.
they're all our favorites. I mean, a good book is a good
No, I
book.
hate something.
What's one you love? Forget favorite. What's one you
We're
love?
talking about, I mean, I don't read kids' books.
That's okay.
So adult books.
Sure, any
One that
right?
was?
Just, she's free to answer with complete honesty.
So I'll give you an answer of a book that I recently loved, but you will not have read it or probably even heard of it. But it's by Abraham Verghese and it's called The Covenant of Water. And it's 800 pages long. I love it.
800 pages. The Covenant of Water.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I read loads and loads. But you know, when I was a kid, there were not as many good kids' books around. I loved a series called The Bobbsey Twins. And if you, as I have done, go back and read one of those books, they're terrible. I mean, they're racist. Anyway, you know, I can't give you the name of, I love Mary Poppins books, but you guys, your age, you know Mary Poppins as a movie. Nobody's read the books.
Was there a book that made you want, where you, the only adequate response to it was, I also want to be a writer? A book that made you want to be a writer?
Yes, and it was when I was 8 years old, and it was a book for adults, oddly. My mother received this book from the Book of the Month Club. My father was overseas in the war, and my mother got this book. It was called The Yearling. And she decided, and our volume, which I still have, had beautiful illustrations by N.C. Wyeth, and the boy who was my age in the book, looked like me, skinny and blonde, and she decided to read it aloud to me. It's a very adult book. It was the first book I'd ever been aware of, because I'd been reading Mary Poppins and the Bobbsey Twins, that had real people who suffered tragedies and loss and lived lives of complicated sorts of desperation. And that was the book that changed my whole literate life.
Thank you.